The morning sun cast long shadows across the industrial landscape of Glenfield as the town slowly came to life. Steam rose from the massive manufacturing plant that had been the heart of the community for over 5 decades. The plant's weathered brick walls and tall smokestacks stood as monuments to a different era, when things were built to last and problems had straightforward solutions. Tom Chen, the plant manager, rubbed his tired eyes as he stared at the water quality report on his desk. It was the 5th time this month the numbers had come back bad, and each time meant shutting down production lines, losing money, and facing increasingly difficult questions from both workers and town officials. The plant's water filtration system, once considered state-of-the-art, was now failing to keep up with modern standards. "This can't go on," he muttered, picking up his phone to make the call he'd been avoiding for weeks. 3 days later, the town hall meeting room was packed to capacity. People stood along the walls and spilled out into the hallway. The air felt thick with worry as Mayor Patel took the podium, her normally cheerful face etched with concern. "As you all know, our town's largest employer is facing serious challenges with their water treatment system," she began, her voice steady despite the tension. "If they can't solve this problem, we're looking at potential EPA fines, temporary shutdowns, or worse." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Everyone in Glenfield knew what worse meant. The plant could close permanently, taking with it nearly a third of the town's jobs. "But I have good news," Mayor Patel continued, her expression brightening slightly. "The town council has secured funding to bring in the best minds to solve this problem once and for all." She gestured toward a group of people seated in the front row, and all heads turned to look. 10 individuals sat with perfect posture, dressed in crisp business attire that seemed out of place among the casual clothes of the townspeople. They radiated confidence and education. "I'd like to introduce you to the team that will be working on our filtration issue," the mayor said, pride evident in her voice. "These engineers have been selected from top firms and universities across the country. Together, they represent over a century of combined experience in water treatment solutions." The lead engineer, Dr. Raj Patel, stepped up to the microphone. With his designer glasses and tailored suit, he looked more like a corporate CEO than someone who would be getting his hands dirty with water samples. He spoke with the practiced ease of someone used to giving presentations to important people. "Good evening, Glenfield," he began, smiling at the crowd. "My team and I are honored to be here. We've reviewed the initial reports, and while your situation is certainly challenging, I want to assure you that we've solved much more complex problems." He clicked a remote, and a complicated diagram appeared on the screen behind him. It showed a maze of pipes, filters, and treatment tanks, with arrows and technical terms that meant little to most people in the room. "Our approach will involve a complete systems analysis, followed by targeted interventions using the latest filtration technology," Dr. Patel explained, pointing to various parts of the diagram. "We're talking about nanofiltration membranes, UV purification systems, and real-time monitoring with AI-assisted controls." In the third row, Elena Morales shifted uncomfortably in her seat. At 58, she had spent most of her adult life working as an administrative assistant at the plant. Her desk sat just outside Tom Chen's office, where she had watched managers and consultants come and go over the decades, each bringing their own solutions that worked for a while before eventually failing. Elena's eyes drifted from the complicated diagram to the window, where she could see the river that had provided water to both the town and the plant for generations. Her grandmother had lived along that same river, teaching Elena how the water changed with the seasons and how to know when it was clean enough to use for different purposes. Those lessons seemed simple compared to what the engineers were proposing, but they had always worked. "We'll begin with a thorough assessment tomorrow," Dr. Patel was saying, "and expect to have our first round of recommendations within 2 weeks. I can't emphasize enough how fortunate your town is to have assembled this team." He gestured to his colleagues, introducing each with their impressive credentials. There was a water chemist from Berkeley, an environmental engineer from MIT, a filtration specialist who had worked on projects in 7 countries, and 7 others with equally impressive backgrounds. As the introductions continued, Elena noticed something about the team that bothered her. None of them seemed particularly interested in the town itself. They looked at their phones during the mayor's speech, exchanged knowing glances when townspeople asked basic questions, and spoke in technical terms without bothering to explain what they meant. It was as if they saw Glenfield as just another problem to solve, rather than a community of real people whose livelihoods depended on their success. After the meeting, Elena watched from across the room as Tom and the mayor showed the engineers a scale model of the plant and the surrounding area. The engineers pointed at different sections, occasionally shaking their heads or making notes on their tablets. They spoke with the confidence of people who believed they already understood the problem before they'd even visited the site. "Quite the fancy team they've brought in," said a voice beside her. Elena turned to see Frank Willis, the plant's longest-serving maintenance worker. At 65, Frank had been at the plant even longer than Elena and knew every pipe, valve, and tank like they were extensions of his own body. "Very fancy," Elena agreed. "Think they'll figure it out?" Frank shrugged, his weathered face skeptical. "They've got the degrees, that's for sure. But knowing something in a classroom isn't the same as knowing it in the real world. That water system has its own personality, and it doesn't always follow what the textbooks say it should do." Elena nodded, thinking of her grandmother's warnings about the river's moods and cycles. The next morning, the engineers arrived at the plant in a fleet of rental cars. They set up a command center in the main conference room, covering the walls with charts, data printouts, and more technical diagrams. Equipment cases were stacked in corners, containing devices that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie rather than a decades-old manufacturing plant. Elena brought in coffee and pastries as requested, setting them on a side table. The engineers barely acknowledged her presence. Deep in discussion about baseline measurements and contamination vectors, she stood for a moment listening to their conversation. "The primary issue appears to be periodic spikes in organic particulates," said the water chemist, pointing to a graph. "But the timing doesn't correlate with any obvious industrial or agricultural activity upstream." "Could be subsurface seepage from old mining operations," suggested another engineer. "Those abandoned mines 10 miles north could be leaching heavy metals during high rainfall periods." Elena thought about mentioning how her grandmother used to talk about the spring churn and fall settling of the river, natural cycles that changed the water's properties, but she held her tongue. These people had advanced degrees and years of specialized training. What could she possibly add that they didn't already know? As days turned into weeks, the plant became a hive of activity. The engineers conducted test after test, installed monitoring equipment at various points in the water system, and collected samples at all hours of the day and night. They spoke in a language of acronyms and technical terms, creating a barrier between themselves and the plant workers who watched their activities with growing curiosity and hope. Dr. Patel gave regular updates to Tom and the town council, always sounding confident despite the lack of concrete progress. "We're narrowing down the variables," he would say, or "we're developing a multifaceted approach that addresses both immediate symptoms and root causes." 1 month into the project, the engineers unveiled their first solution, a chemical treatment system that would inject a proprietary compound into the water at specific points in the filtration process. The compound, they explained, would bind to contaminants and make them easier to filter out. The system cost nearly $500,000 to install, requiring specialized parts shipped from overseas and a team of technicians working around the clock. When it was finally operational, everyone held their breath as the first treated water samples were tested. The results looked promising for 3 days. Then, mysteriously, the contamination levels began rising again, eventually reaching nearly the same levels as before. The engineers were baffled, but undeterred. "A temporary setback," Dr. Patel assured everyone. "We just need to recalibrate the chemical ratios and adjust the injection timing." But the recalibrations didn't work either, nor did the additional monitoring equipment they installed to try to pinpoint where the system was failing. As Elena filed reports and scheduled meetings, she noticed the engineers spending more time arguing among themselves. The initial unity of purpose was fracturing as different experts pushed their own theories and solutions. The water chemist insisted the problem was chemical in nature, while the environmental engineer was convinced it was a biological contaminant. Others suggested mechanical failures, design flaws, or even sabotage. 2 months in, with costs mounting and no sustainable solution in sight, Elena overheard Dr. Patel on the phone with someone, his voice tense. "I understand the importance, but this is proving more complex than anticipated," he said. pacing near the window. Yes, we've tried that approach. No, the particulate levels are still fluctuating unpredictably. I know our reputation is on the line here, but rushing to conclusions could make things worse. When he hung up, Elena pretended to be organizing files nearby. Dr. Patel looked tired, the confidence in his eyes dimming for the first time since he'd arrived. "Is everything okay?" she asked, unable to stop herself. He seemed startled, as if noticing her for the first time despite her having brought him coffee every morning for weeks. "Yes, fine," he said quickly, straightening his posture. "Just some pressure from above to accelerate our timeline. But quality solutions can't be rushed." Elena nodded and returned to her desk, wondering how much longer the town's patience and budget would last. Outside her window, she could see the river flowing as it always had, carrying the stories and secrets her grandmother had taught her to recognize. Whatever the engineers were missing, she suspected it might be something simple, something so obvious that their sophisticated instruments and complex theories were causing them to overlook it entirely. 3 months into the project, the mood at the plant had shifted from hopeful to anxious. The team of engineers now worked with a frantic energy, their earlier confidence replaced by stubborn determination. The conference room they'd claimed as their command center was barely recognizable. Walls covered with data charts, whiteboards filled with calculations, and tables cluttered with water samples and testing equipment. Dr. Patel stood before the town council, trying to maintain his professional composure despite the increasingly hostile questions being fired at him. "So you're telling us," Mayor Patel said, tapping her pen against the table, "that after 3 months and nearly $2 million, we're essentially back where we started." The engineer adjusted his glasses, a nervous habit that had become more frequent in recent weeks. "I wouldn't characterize it that way, Mayor. We've eliminated dozens of potential causes and narrowed down the possible solutions considerably." "But the water still isn't clean," said Councilwoman Rodriguez, her voice sharp. "And the EPA inspector is due in less than 3 months. If we haven't fixed this by then, they could shut down the plant entirely." Dr. Patel nodded, the weight of the situation visible in the slump of his shoulders. "My team understands the urgency. We're implementing a new approach starting tomorrow. A multi-stage filtration system using advanced membrane technology. The components are being rushed in as we speak." Outside the meeting room, Elena sat at her desk, pretending to focus on scheduling but actually listening to every word. The plant had been her workplace for over 20 years, and the people there were like family to her. The thought of it closing sent a chill through her heart that had nothing to do with the autumn air coming through the partially open window. "They're going to try another fancy system," Tom said as he emerged from the meeting, closing the door behind him. His face looked older than it had just 3 months ago. New worry lines etched around his eyes. Elena handed him a cup of coffee, black with 1 sugar, just as he liked it. "Will this one work?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. Tom sighed, leaning against her desk. "It has to. We're running out of options and money." He took a sip of coffee and gazed out the window toward the river. "You know, my grandfather worked at this plant when it first opened. He used to tell me stories about how they figured things out through trial and error, using simple solutions that worked with nature instead of trying to control it." Elena nodded, thinking about her own grandmother's wisdom. "Sometimes the old ways had something to them," she said carefully. "Maybe," Tom agreed, "but the world's different now. The regulations are stricter, production demands are higher, and the old solutions probably wouldn't cut it anymore." He straightened up, squaring his shoulders. "The engineers know what they're doing. They just need more time." But time was the one thing they didn't have. As autumn deepened, the new filtration system was installed with great fanfare. It was an impressive sight. Gleaming steel tanks, digital control panels, and a network of color-coded pipes that connected to the existing system. The engineers worked around the clock to get it operational, testing and adjusting with meticulous attention to detail. For a brief, glorious week, it seemed to work. The water tests came back cleaner than they had been in months, and a cautious optimism spread through the plant. Dr. Patel's team celebrated with a small party in their conference room, though Elena noticed that several of them still looked worried, despite the champagne and congratulatory speeches. Then came the heavy rains. A 3-day downpour swelled the river to near flood levels, and something changed in the water coming into the plant. The new system, designed for precision rather than flexibility, couldn't handle the sudden increase in sediment and organic material. Filters clogged, pressure built up in the wrong places, and one night a main junction pipe burst, flooding part of the treatment facility. It's a setback, not a failure, Dr. Patel insisted as workers mopped up the mess and engineers huddled over emergency repairs. We just need to add a pre-treatment stage to handle the variable input quality. But Elena, bringing coffee to the exhausted workers, overheard two of the younger engineers talking in low voices near the supply closet. "We're missing something fundamental," said the woman, her MIT sweatshirt splattered with muddy water. "These solutions should be working. The math checks out, the chemistry is sound, but it's like the water itself is fighting us." Her colleague nodded, rubbing his bloodshot eyes. "Raj won't admit it, but I think we're approaching this all wrong. We keep treating it like a standard industrial contamination problem, but it doesn't behave like anything in the literature. Maybe it's multiple issues overlapping, or something specific to this geographic area. Maybe. But we've run every test in the book and then some. If there's something unique about this site, it's not showing up in our data." They noticed Elena then and quickly changed the subject, but their words stayed with her. That night, instead of going straight home, she took a detour to the small house where she'd grown up, now occupied by her cousin who was away visiting family. The house sat on a hill overlooking the river, and the backyard still contained her grandmother's garden, now mostly wild but still bearing herbs and flowers that had self-seeded over the years. Elena walked through the overgrown paths, remembering how her grandmother would gather certain plants depending on the season and the color of the river. There had been a wisdom there that couldn't be measured with scientific instruments, a deep understanding born from generations of observation and connection to the land. The next day, the engineers unveiled their latest plan, chemical additives to stabilize the water properties before it entered the main filtration system. It was yet another expensive solution requiring specialized equipment and materials that would take weeks to arrive. In the meantime, they implemented a temporary fix that kept the plant operating but at reduced capacity. As weeks 5 and 6 dragged by, tensions mounted. The engineers began to argue openly, their unified front crumbling under the pressure of repeated failures. 2 of them left the project entirely, citing other commitments but really fleeing what increasingly looked like a career-damaging debacle. The remaining 8 doubled down, working longer hours and proposing increasingly complex solutions. "We need to completely rebuild the intake system," argued one engineer during a particularly heated meeting that Elena observed while bringing in lunch trays. "That would take months and millions more dollars," countered another. "We should focus on neutralizing the specific contaminants we've identified, which would be fine if they were consistent, but they keep changing with no discernible pattern." Dr. Patel tried to maintain order, but Elena could see the strain taking its toll. The confident leader who had arrived in Glenfield promising quick solutions now looked haggard and uncertain. Meanwhile, winter approached. The leaves turned brilliant colors and fell, coating the riverbanks with a carpet of red and gold that gradually turned brown. Morning frost appeared on the plant's windows, and workers began wearing jackets inside the drafty old building. The chemical stabilization system, when it finally arrived and was installed, worked no better than previous solutions. It seemed effective during initial testing, only to mysteriously fail when scaled up to full production levels. No one could explain why. In desperation, the engineers began working in shifts around the clock, monitoring every aspect of the water treatment process in real time, hoping to catch whatever was causing the persistent problems. They installed additional sensors, collected more data, and ran increasingly obscure analyses, looking for patterns that might explain what they were missing. Elena watched it all with growing concern. One evening, as she was leaving work, she found Dr. Patel alone in the conference room, staring at a wall of data charts with a look of complete exhaustion. "Can I get you anything before I go?" she asked, pausing in the doorway. "Coffee, something to eat?" He turned, seeming surprised to see her. "No, thank you. I'm fine." But he clearly wasn't fine. His clothes were rumpled, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. Elena hesitated, then stepped into the room. "I hope you don't mind me saying, but you look like you could use a break. Even brilliant minds need rest." A small smile flickered across his face. "Brilliant? Not feeling very brilliant at the moment," He gestured to the charts. 6 years of graduate school, 12 years in the field, and I'm being defeated by water from a small-town river. The river here has always been tricky, Elena said carefully. It changes with the seasons in ways that aren't always obvious. Dr. Patel looked at her with new interest. You've lived here a long time, haven't you? All my life. My grandmother's family has been here since before the plant was built. He nodded thoughtfully. Local knowledge can sometimes provide insights that outside experts miss. Is there anything about this river that might help us understand what we're dealing with? Elena thought about her grandmother's garden, about the plants that grew along the riverbank and how they changed throughout the year. She thought about the stories of the water's moods and cycles, passed down through generations. There might be, she said slowly, but it's not the kind of thing that would show up in scientific tests. It's more about patterns and relationships that you can only learn by watching the river through many seasons. Dr. Patel sighed, turning back to his charts. At this point, I'd welcome any insight, scientific or otherwise, but I'm not sure the rest of the team would be as open-minded. Engineers tend to trust data more than stories. Elena nodded, understanding all too well. Well, if you ever want to hear those stories, I'm happy to share them. Thank you, he said, but his attention was already back on the problems before him, the moment of connection passing as quickly as it had come. As Elena walked to her car, she looked toward the river, barely visible in the gathering darkness. The engineers were running out of options, the plant was running out of time, and the town was running out of hope. Something had to change, and soon. Winter settled over Glenfield like a heavy blanket. Snow dusted the factory rooftops and transformed the riverbanks into a landscape of white. Inside the plant, tensions ran as cold as the weather outside. The team of engineers, now reduced to 8 after 2 more departures, had gone from collaboration to competition, each trying to prove their approach was the right one. Elena watched it all from her quiet corner of the administrative office. 5 months had passed since the engineers first arrived, and with each failed attempt, the mood throughout the plant grew darker. Workers whispered about updating their resumes, and local businesses braced for the economic impact if the plant closed. One morning in early December, Elena arrived to find Tom slumped at his desk, staring at a letter with the EPA logo at the top. Bad news? She asked, setting down his coffee. Tom nodded, pushing the letter toward her. They've moved up the inspection to the end of January. We have less than 8 weeks to fix this, or they'll shut us down for environmental violations. Elena's stomach tightened as she scanned the official language of the letter. What do the engineers say? Dr. Patel thinks their latest approach might work, Tom said, but his voice lacked conviction. They're calling it a hybrid biofiltration system. Basically combines several of their previous attempts with some new components. They're presenting it to the town council tomorrow. Elena made a mental note to attend that meeting. Over the past months, she'd been quietly researching on her own, visiting the library to read about water purification, and spending weekends walking along different parts of the river. Her grandmother's stories about the water kept coming back to her, especially one about how the old paper mill used to clean their water before modern technology took over. The town council meeting the next day was tense from the start. The conference room at Town Hall was packed, not just with council members but with plant workers and concerned citizens. Dr. Patel and his remaining team stood at the front, their presentation materials ready, but the exhaustion on their faces was impossible to hide. Mayor Patel opened with a grim update. As most of you know, we're now facing a hard deadline from the EPA. If we can't bring our water treatment system into compliance by the end of January, the plant will be forced to close until violations are addressed, which could take months. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A closure of even a few weeks would be devastating to many families. Dr. Patel stepped forward, his professional demeanor firmly in place despite the pressure. We understand the urgency of the situation and believe we have developed a solution that addresses the unique challenges presented by your water system. Launched into a technical explanation of their hybrid approach, using simplified terms but still losing many in the audience with talk of bioactive membranes and sequential filtration matrices. Diagrams on the screen showed complicated systems of tanks, filters, and chemical injection points. The total cost for implementation would be approximately $2.8 million, Dr. Patel concluded, with an installation timeline of 3 to 4 weeks. The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Councilman Thompson spoke up, his voice tight with frustration. Dr. Patel, with all due respect, this sounds remarkably similar to ideas your team has presented before, ideas that ultimately failed. Why should we believe this time will be different? Dr. Patel bristled slightly. Each previous approach taught us something valuable about the specific properties of your water source. This solution incorporates all those lessons. At a cost of nearly $3 million, Councilwoman Rodriguez pointed out, money the town simply doesn't have, especially after what we've already spent. The alternative is closure, Dr. Patel countered, which would cost far more in lost wages and economic impact. The debate continued, growing more heated as council members questioned the engineers' track record, and the engineers defended their expertise. Elena sat quietly in the back, watching the back and forth like a tennis match. The engineers were clearly smart people, but they were missing something fundamental about the river and the land it flowed through. Almost without realizing it, Elena found herself standing up. A hush fell over the room as people turned to look at her. I might have something to add, she said, her voice shaky but determined. Mayor Patel looked surprised but nodded. Go ahead, Elena. Elena made her way to the front of the room, feeling the weight of all those eyes on her. She'd never been one for public speaking, but concern for her community pushed her forward. I've worked at the plant for over 20 years, she began, and I've lived beside the river my whole life. My grandmother's family has been here for generations, and they knew this river better than anyone. She paused, gathering her thoughts, aware of the engineers watching her with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed impatience. And the thing about our river is that it changes with the seasons in ways that aren't obvious if you haven't watched it for years. My grandmother used to call it a river with moods. What works to clean the water in summer might not work in winter. What works during dry spells fails during rainy seasons. Dr. Patel cleared his throat. We've accounted for seasonal variations in our data collection. With respect, Elena interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. There are things about this river that don't show up in data. The old paper mill that used to operate upstream figured this out decades ago. They tried fancy filtering systems too, but nothing worked consistently until they started working with the river instead of fighting against it. Interest flickered across Dr. Patel's face. What do you mean working with the river? Elena turned to face the council. I've been doing research at the library, reading old newspaper articles and company records from when the paper mill operated. They eventually created a natural filtration system using local limestone and specific plants that grew along the riverbank. It wasn't high-tech, but it worked year-round because it mimicked the way the river naturally cleans itself. The room was silent now, everyone listening intently. My grandmother showed me these plants when I was a child. They still grow along certain parts of the river, especially near the old mill site. Some have special properties that can bind to metals and break down organic contaminants. The limestone beds they used created an environment where helpful bacteria could thrive, doing most of the cleaning work naturally. Tom leaned forward. Are you suggesting we abandon modern filtration and go back to some kind of plant-based system? Not exactly, Elena said. I'm suggesting we combine approaches. The old paper mill didn't have the technology we have today, but they understood something about our specific river that these engineered systems are missing. What if we created a preliminary filtration stage using local materials and plants that are already adapted to our river's unique properties, then followed it with a more modern system? Dr. Patel frowned thoughtfully. A bioremediation pretreatment stage? It's not conventional for industrial applications, but conventional approaches haven't worked. Mayor Patel finished for him. Elena, do you have any specific information about this system? How it was constructed? Elena nodded, reaching into her bag for the folder of photocopied articles and diagrams she'd collected. It's all here. Old blueprints from the mill, articles about how it worked, even some scientific studies that were done when the university researchers came to study it in the 1970s. The youngest engineer stepped forward, her interest clearly piqued. May I? She asked, holding out her hand for the folder. As she flipped through the pages, her expression changed from skepticism to growing interest. She showed a diagram to Dr. Patel, pointing to something and whispering excitedly. Dr. Patel studied it for a long moment before looking up at Elena with new respect. This is surprisingly sophisticated for something developed before modern environmental engineering, The sequential placement of different plant species, the limestone gradients. There's actual science behind this, even if they didn't call it that at the time. And it worked, Elena emphasized, for over 30 years until the mill closed and the system was abandoned. Tom stood up. But building something like this would take time, wouldn't it? Time we don't have before the EPA inspection. Not necessarily, Elena said. The basic structure of settlement ponds already exists from an old system the plant used in the 1980s. They're overgrown now, but the framework is there, and the plants we need still grow locally. I could show you where to find them. A spark of hope flickered in the room for the first time in months. Council members exchanged glances, and plant workers sat up straighter in their chairs. Dr. Patel huddled with his team, speaking in low, urgent tones. After a few minutes, he turned back to the council. We would need to thoroughly review these historical materials and verify the approach, he said carefully. But there may be merit in exploring a hybrid system that incorporates these local, natural elements as a pre-treatment stage. It could potentially address the variable quality issues we've been struggling with, and at a significantly lower cost than our original proposal. Mayor Patel looked at Elena with newfound appreciation. How quickly could a preliminary assessment be done? If Ms. Morales could show us these plants and the old settlement pond structures tomorrow, we could have an initial feasibility report by the end of the week, Dr. Patel replied. Elena felt a wave of relief wash over her. Finally, someone was listening. I'd be happy to show you everything I've found, she said. As the meeting adjourned, people gathered around Elena, asking questions and offering help. The cloud of despair that had hung over the town for months seemed to lift slightly, replaced by cautious optimism. Dr. Patel approached her last, extending his hand. I apologize for not seeking your input sooner, he said, genuine regret in his voice. Sometimes we experts get so focused on our sophisticated solutions that we overlook the wisdom that comes from simply living with and observing a place over time. Elena shook his hand, a small smile forming. My grandmother used to say that the longest knowledge isn't always the same as the deepest knowledge. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman, Dr. Patel replied. I look forward to learning more about her understanding of the river tomorrow. As Elena drove home that night, snowflakes dancing in her headlights, she felt a mix of nerves and excitement. There was no guarantee that her idea would work, but for the first time in months, there was a real chance to save the plant and protect the river, using knowledge that had been there all along, waiting for someone to remember it. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the landscape glittering with frost under a pale winter sun. Elena arrived at the plant early, dressed in her warmest boots and a heavy coat, ready to lead the engineers to the old settlement ponds and show them the special plants her grandmother had taught her about. To her surprise, all 8 remaining engineers were waiting, bundled up against the cold and equipped with notebooks, sample containers, and cameras. I didn't expect everyone to come, Elena said as she approached the group. Dr. Patel smiled, looking more energized than he had in weeks. After reviewing those old papers last night, everyone wanted to see this for themselves. It's quite remarkable how sophisticated that old system was, especially considering when it was built. The youngest engineer, whose name Elena had learned was Dr. Cho, stepped forward eagerly. I stayed up half the night reading about bioremediation systems. The principles in those old mill designs actually align with some cutting-edge research happening now. It's just that nobody's applied them at an industrial scale like this in decades. Elena felt a flutter of pride as she led the group away from the plant and along a snowy path that followed the river upstream. The engineers trudged behind her, their usual professional reserve giving way to curiosity as they peppered her with questions about the river, the plants, and her grandmother's knowledge. After about 20 minutes of walking, they reached an area where the riverbank widened into what looked like a series of overgrown, snow-covered ponds. This is it, Elena said, gesturing to the space. The old settlement system from the paper mill. It's been abandoned for years, but the basic structure is still intact. The engineers spread out, brushing away snow to examine the frozen ground and the remnants of concrete channels that connected the series of shallow basins. Dr. Patel knelt by the edge of one pond, using a small tool to chip through the ice and collect a sample of the sediment beneath. These were designed to slow the water down as it moved through, Elena explained. pointing to the different levels. Each pond had different types of stone and plants that would filter out different things from the water. Dr. Cho examined the crumbling concrete dividers between ponds. The engineering is simple but effective. They created different microenvironments in each basin. Brilliant, really. And these are the plants? Dr. Patel asked, pointing to some dried stalks poking through the snow. Elena shook her head. Most are dormant in winter, but I can show you where they grow and what they look like. She pulled out a small photo album from her bag. I took pictures last summer and fall and matched them with the old diagrams from the mill. The engineers gathered around, examining the photos of various plants with green leaves, purple flowers, and thick roots that grew along the riverbank. This one, Elena said, pointing to a plant with slender leaves, my grandmother called river cleaner. It has roots that can absorb metals from the water, and this one creates a kind of natural foam that traps tiny particles so they settle to the bottom instead of flowing downstream. Dr. Patel looked up from the photos with new respect in his eyes. These are known phytoremediators. Plants specifically evolved to clean contaminated water. Some of these species are being studied by environmental scientists for cleaning up pollution. My grandmother didn't know the scientific names, Elena said with a small smile, but she knew exactly what they did and where they grew best. For the next 2 hours, the group explored the old system. The engineers took samples, made sketches, and discussed how the natural system could be integrated with modern technology. Elena watched in growing amazement as their skepticism transformed into genuine enthusiasm. We could restore these settlement ponds within 2 weeks if we had enough help, Dr. Cho said, excitement clear in her voice. The basic structure is sound, it just needs cleaning and rebuilding the dividers. Then we'd need to create a temporary growing environment for the plants since it's winter. A greenhouse, another engineer suggested. We could set up grow lights and temperature control to cultivate enough plants for the initial setup, then transition to naturally growing ones when spring comes. Dr. Patel nodded thoughtfully. And we could integrate a scaled-down version of our filtration system as a final stage, after the water has gone through the natural treatment. It would be far less expensive than our original plan, and potentially more effective for this specific location. As they walked back to the plant, ideas flowed freely between Elena and the engineers. The technical language had given way to practical problem-solving, with everyone contributing their knowledge. For the first time, Elena felt like a valued member of the team rather than just the person who brought coffee. Back at the plant, they gathered in the conference room, spreading out their notes and samples. Tom joined them, his face lighting up with hope as Dr. Patel outlined their findings. We believe this hybrid approach has genuine merit, Dr. Patel explained. The natural filtration system addresses the variable water quality issues that have been plaguing our engineered solutions. By letting nature do the heavy lifting first, our technology can then finish the job more effectively. And the cost? Tom asked the ever-practical manager. Dr. Cho jumped in. Preliminary estimates suggest less than a third of what our last proposal would have cost. The biggest expenses would be restoring the settlement ponds and setting up the greenhouse to grow the initial plants. What about the timeline? Tom pressed. The EPA inspection is less than 8 weeks away. Dr. Patel exchanged glances with his team. It's tight but possible. We'd need to start immediately and have all hands on deck. The local knowledge will be crucial. Elena's understanding of the plants and how they interact with the river at different times of year is information we couldn't get from any textbook. Tom turned to Elena with a look of newfound appreciation. You never mentioned any of this before. Elena shrugged slightly. I didn't think anyone would listen to an administrative assistant talking about her grandmother's plants when there were expert engineers here. Well, I'm listening now, Tom said firmly. We all are. If you're willing to help us implement this, I'll make sure you're given whatever time and resources you need. Over the next 2 days, the team developed a detailed implementation plan. The town council approved it unanimously, relieved both by the lower cost and by the involvement of local knowledge they trusted. Workers from the plant volunteered extra hours to help clear and rebuild the settlement ponds. And the local greenhouse offered space and expertise to start growing the needed plants. Word spread quickly through Glenfield. What had begun as Elena's solitary idea soon became a community project. Retired workers who remembered the old mill system came forward with additional information. High school students volunteered to help with the planting. Local businesses donated equipment and supplies. The engineers, who had once been seen as outsiders, worked alongside the townspeople, their technical expertise now complemented by local wisdom rather than operating in isolation from it. Dr. Patel and his team adapted their original designs, creating a sophisticated monitoring system that would work with the natural filtration process instead of trying to replace it. Elena found herself in the unexpected position of project coordinator, bridging the gap between scientific knowledge and local experience. Her quiet administrative skills proved perfect for organizing the complex effort, while her understanding of both the plant's needs and the river's natural cycles helped guide the design decisions. I never imagined I'd be doing anything like this, she confided to Dr. Patel one evening as they reviewed plans in the conference room. Now transformed into project headquarters, charts and diagrams still covered the walls, but now they featured drawings of plants alongside the technical specifications. Sometimes the most valuable expertise isn't the kind that comes with degrees, Dr. Patel replied. I've learned more about practical water treatment in these past days than in some of my university courses. Your grandmother's knowledge, passed down through generations of observation, has insights our modern methods missed entirely. Elena smiled, thinking of her grandmother's patient lessons by the riverside. She would have loved seeing all this. She always said the river had all the answers if people would just learn how to listen to it. As January arrived, the project took shape with remarkable speed. The settlement ponds were cleared and rebuilt, with carefully calculated gradients and dividers to create the optimal flow pattern. In the borrowed greenhouse space, the first crops of purifying plants grew under special lights, nurtured by volunteers who followed Elena's guidance. The integration with modern technology proved trickier, requiring several redesigns as the engineers learned to work with, rather than against, the natural system. But with each challenge came new insights, and solutions often emerged from the unlikely collaboration between technical experts and local knowledge holders. A week before the EPA inspection, they were ready for the first full test. The restored settlement ponds were in place, planted with the first batch of greenhouse-grown plants. The modern filtration system had been modified and installed as the final stage of the process. Monitoring equipment stood ready to measure water quality at every step. The entire town seemed to hold its breath as the system was activated. Water began flowing through the natural ponds, moving slowly from one basin to the next, interacting with the carefully placed plants and limestone beds. After passing through all the natural stages, it entered the modified modern system for final processing. Engineers and plant workers crowded around the monitoring screens, watching as the first readings came in. Initial results looked promising, but everyone knew the real test would come after the system had been running for at least 24 hours. The next day, Elena arrived at the plant to find Dr. Patel and Dr. Cho already there, analyzing the overnight data. Their faces told her everything before they spoke a word. "It's working," Dr. Cho said, barely containing her excitement. "The water quality coming out of the final stage is better than we even hoped for, well below the EPA requirements. And the best part," Dr. Patel added, "is that when we introduced a simulation of heavy rainfall overnight, the kind of variable that caused our previous systems to fail, the natural ponds simply absorbed the changes and kept working. The plants in limestone actually perform better with the increased flow, compensating perfectly for the variations." Elena felt tears spring to her eyes as relief and pride washed over her. "My grandmother always said these plants were smartest when the river was at its worst." Tom entered the room, took one look at their faces, and broke into the first genuine smile Elena had seen from him in months. "Tell me that look means what I think it means." Dr. Patel handed him the data readout. "See for yourself. We've not only met the EPA standards, we've exceeded them. And the system is stable even under stress testing." Tom studied the numbers, then looked up at the unusual team that had made it possible: world-class engineers, and a local administrative assistant with generations of river wisdom in her blood. "I don't know who to thank first," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "All of you have saved this plant and this town." "Thank Elena's grandmother," Dr. Patel said simply. "And thank the river itself. We just finally learned how to listen to what it was trying to tell us all along." The day of the EPA inspection arrived, with a light snowfall that dusted Glenfield like powdered sugar. Ellen awoke before dawn, too nervous to sleep despite the confidence everyone had in their new system. This wasn't just about passing an inspection. It was about proving that sometimes the best solutions came from unexpected places. She arrived at the plant to find a small crowd already gathered. Workers whose jobs depended on a successful outcome stood in small groups, sipping coffee from thermoses and speaking in hushed tones. The engineering team huddled near the main entrance, reviewing data on tablets and making last-minute checks of the monitoring systems. "There you are," Tom called when he spotted her, waving her over to where he stood with Dr. Patel. "Our water quality expert has arrived." Elena felt her cheeks warm at being described this way. 6 months ago, she had been just an administrative assistant who brought coffee and filed reports. Now she was a key part of the team that might save the plant. "Any changes overnight?" she asked, glancing at the data screen Dr. Patel held. "Steady as a rock," he replied with evident satisfaction. Even with the temperature drop and snow, the system maintained optimal performance. The plants are thriving in their greenhouse environment, and the limestone beds are doing exactly what they should. A black SUV with government plates pulled into the parking lot, and the murmuring crowd fell silent. A woman in a dark coat emerged, carrying a briefcase and wearing the serious expression of someone who took regulations very seriously. "That's her," Tom whispered. "Dorothy Wilson, Senior EPA Inspector, known for being thorough and by the book." Mayor Patel stepped forward to greet the inspector, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries before leading her toward the plant entrance. As they approached, Tom, Dr. Patel, and Elena moved to join them. "These are our project leads," Mayor Patel explained. "Tom Chen, plant manager, Dr. Raj Patel, head of our engineering team, and Elena Morales, our local environmental specialist who designed the natural components of our new system." Inspector Wilson shook each of their hands, her gaze lingering on Elena with slight surprise. "Environmental specialist? What's your background, Ms. Morales?" Elena felt a moment of panic. She had no formal qualifications, no degrees to cite. "Ms. Morales brings generations of local knowledge about our river ecosystem." Dr. Patel stepped in smoothly. Her understanding of the native phytoremediating plants and their interaction with our specific water chemistry was invaluable. She represents the kind of traditional ecological knowledge that modern environmental science is increasingly recognizing as essential. The inspector's eyebrows rose slightly, but she nodded. "Interesting. I look forward to seeing this system in action." The tour began at the river intake, where Inspector Wilson took initial water samples for testing. She followed the water's path through the restored settlement ponds, now partially enclosed in a temporary greenhouse structure to protect the plants from winter weather. Elena explained each stage of the natural filtration process, pointing out the different plants and their specific roles. "This one binds heavy metals in its roots," she said, indicating a bushy plant with slender stems. "And this one creates a natural environment for beneficial bacteria that break down organic contaminants." Inspector Wilson listened attentively, occasionally asking technical questions that Dr. Patel answered. She took more samples at each stage of the process, labeled them carefully, and made detailed notes. The final stop was the modern filtration facility, where the naturally pre-treated water underwent its final cleaning before being used in the plant's manufacturing processes. Here the engineers took the lead, explaining how they had modified their original designs to work in harmony with the natural system, rather than trying to do everything with technology alone. "The water requires significantly less chemical treatment now," Dr. Cho explained, showing comparison charts on a large monitor. "The natural system handles most of the variable contaminants, so our technology can be more targeted and efficient." Throughout the inspection, which lasted nearly 5 hours, Elena watched Inspector Wilson's face for any hint of her thoughts. The woman remained professionally neutral, asking pointed questions and examining every aspect of the system with meticulous attention to detail. By the time they returned to the conference room for the debriefing, Elena's nerves were stretched to the breaking point. Inspector Wilson sat at the head of the table, reviewing her notes and the preliminary test results from the samples she'd taken. The room was silent except for the occasional shuffling of papers and clearing of throats. Finally, she looked up. "Based on my inspection today and these initial readings, I can tell you that your facility is not only in compliance with EPA standards but significantly exceeds them in several key areas." A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. Tom closed his eyes briefly, the weight of months of worry visibly lifting from his shoulders. In fact, Inspector Wilson continued, this hybrid system you've developed is quite remarkable. I've never seen anything quite like it in an industrial setting. The integration of traditional ecological knowledge with modern technology creates an adaptive system that appears capable of handling the seasonal variations that often challenge conventional treatment methods. She turned to Elena. Ms. Morales, the plant selection and arrangement is particularly impressive. These are exactly the kind of nature-based solutions the EPA has been trying to encourage in our recent guidance documents. Elena felt a surge of pride. My grandmother would be very happy to hear that. She always believed in working with nature instead of against it. Inspector Wilson nodded, then addressed the whole group. I'll need to complete my full report, of course, but I can tell you now that you'll be receiving full clearance to continue operations. In fact, I'd like to suggest that your facility be considered for our Green Innovation Recognition Program. This kind of solution, cost-effective, environmentally sound, and rooted in local knowledge, is exactly what many struggling industrial communities could benefit from. The meeting concluded with handshakes all around and promises to share the final test results within the week. As Inspector Wilson departed, the tension that had gripped the plant for months finally broke. Workers cheered, engineers hugged each other, and Mayor Patel announced an impromptu celebration at the town hall that evening. In the midst of the excitement, Elena slipped away to a quiet spot by the window overlooking the river. Dr. Patel found her there a few minutes later. Not joining the celebration? He asked, coming to stand beside her. Elena smiled, watching the snow falling gently on the water. Just taking a moment to let it all sink in. It doesn't quite feel real yet. It's very real, Dr. Patel assured her, and largely thanks to you. I've been thinking about how differently this might have turned out if you hadn't spoken up at that town meeting, or if you hadn't been willing to listen, Elena pointed out. Many experts wouldn't have given a second thought to some old stories about plants and river cycles. Dr. Patel nodded thoughtfully. It's made me reconsider a lot of things about how we approach engineering problems. The most sophisticated technology isn't always the best solution, especially when we're working with natural systems that have their own intelligence. My grandmother used to say that the land remembers what works. If we pay attention to the patterns, Elena said softly. She was right. Dr. Patel turned to face her directly, which is why I'd like to offer you a position on our team. We've been commissioned to help several other facilities with similar water quality issues, and your perspective would be invaluable. Elena blinked in surprise. But I don't have any formal qualifications. No degree in environmental science or engineering. You have something just as valuable, the ability to see connections that others miss, and knowledge that's been tested over generations. We can teach technical skills, but that kind of wisdom is much harder to come by. He smiled. Besides, after what you've accomplished here, who's going to question your qualifications? 6 months later, on a warm spring day, Elena stood at the edge of the settlement ponds, now flourishing with plants in full bloom. The temporary greenhouse had been removed as the weather warmed, revealing a thriving ecosystem that worked in harmony with the technological systems downstream. The Glenfield plant had not only remained open, but was now operating more efficiently than ever. With lower costs and a smaller environmental footprint, the water leaving the facility was cleaner than the regulatory requirements demanded, and the river itself showed signs of improved health. But the impact extended far beyond one factory in one small town. Word of their innovative solution had spread, drawing attention from other communities facing similar challenges. Elena and the engineering team had already helped implement modified versions of their hybrid system in 3 other facilities, adapting the approach to different local conditions and plant species. Universities had sent researchers to study the Glenfield model, and several papers had been published in environmental journals. Dr. Patel and Elena had been invited to speak at conferences, sharing their experience of combining traditional ecological knowledge with modern engineering. Most meaningful to Elena was the change she saw in her own community. The collaboration had broken down barriers between the experts and the locals, creating new respect for different kinds of knowledge. High school students were now involved in monitoring the plant life in the settlement ponds, learning both scientific principles and traditional ecological practices. The town had started a seed bank to preserve the native plants that had proven so valuable. ensuring this knowledge wouldn't be lost again. As she watched a group of visiting engineers touring the facility, Elena thought about the journey that had brought them here. What had begun as a crisis had transformed into an opportunity, not just to solve a water quality problem, but to reimagine how humans could work with natural systems instead of trying to control them. A familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. "Still hard to believe sometimes, isn't it?" Tom asked, coming to stand beside her. As plant manager, he now proudly showcased their unique system to visitors from around the country. Elena smiled, watching a butterfly land on one of her grandmother's river cleaner plants. "Not really. The solution was always here, flowing right past us. We just needed to remember how to see it." Tom nodded, looking out over the thriving ponds toward the river beyond. Sometimes the most powerful innovations aren't about creating something new, but about rediscovering something ancient. In the distance, another tour group approached, eager to learn from Glenfield's success. Elena straightened her shoulders, ready to share the story once again, a story of how 10 highly trained engineers with all their technology and expertise had been stumped by a problem that was ultimately solved by a simple woman's connection to the wisdom of her ancestors and the rhythms of the river that had sustained her community for generations. It was a story that was changing how people thought about expertise and innovation, a story that reminded everyone that solutions often came from unexpected places, if only we were humble enough to listen.